sank into seat 8A, her body aching from long hours spent at the flight academy. The morning sun spilled lazily through the plane's oval windows, catching the strands of her hair that had escaped her tight bun. She barely noticed the hum of the engines, the soft chatter of passengers settling into their seats, or the occasional squeak of the landing gear retracting. Her eyelids were heavy, exhaustion pulling her down, luring her into the rare luxury of a nap. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to sink into the oblivion of sleep, the worries of training pilots and raising her young daughter temporarily forgotten. Had been an Air Force combat pilot once. The memory of those days lurked quietly beneath the surface, a shadow she rarely let emerge. She had flown through storms over the mountains of Afghanistan, dodged missiles, and maneuvered through hostile skies with the weight of her squadron on her shoulders. But now, in the sterile, humming cabin of a commercial flight, she felt worlds away from that life. This was meant to be a simple flight, a routine journey from Seattle to Washington, D.C., a step back into ordinary life after years of extraordinary danger. The sign blinked off, and a few passengers shuffled toward the restrooms or stretched in the aisle. A mother tried to calm a fussy toddler. An elderly man squinted out the window, pointing at the clouds below. His head lolled slightly to the side, the soft rumble of the engines like a lullaby. She thought briefly of her daughter, Emma, and felt a pang of guilt. She had missed so many milestones, so many first words and first steps. Flying had demanded everything from her, and leaving had not freed her. It had left her in a strange limbo of civilian life, where danger was gone but purpose felt faint. The flight attendants went down the aisle, distributing drinks and answering last-minute questions. One paused briefly beside, giving her a polite smile, unaware of the war stories hidden behind her calm expression. Barely nodded, too tired to respond. Her mind drifted further back to the hangars, the roar of fighter jets, the smell of aviation fuel, the adrenaline that had once defined her life. She remembered the camaraderie of her squadron, the unspoken bond between pilots who had seen combat together. Memories flickered like an old film reel, some comforting, some haunting. A slight turbulence nudged the plane, and his hand instinctively clutched the armrest. Nothing serious, just the usual bump as the aircraft ascended into the higher layers of the atmosphere. A nervous passenger let out a small gasp and barely opened one eye to glance around. Everyone else seemed calm, or pretending to be. She closed her eyes again, sighing, letting the tension slip from her shoulders, allowing herself to rest for the few precious moments left before the demands of life and the unknown would intrude once more. But even in this quiet, mundane moment, a subtle tension existed, invisible to most. Something about the flight felt slightly off. Perhaps it was the flicker of lightning on the horizon, or the way the clouds seemed to thicken unusually fast. Didn't notice it consciously. She was too deep in the cocoon of half-sleep, the comforting monotony of the cabin masking the storm that awaited her. She dreamed briefly of her last combat mission. The sky was dark, filled with distant flares and tracer rounds. The roar of engines and shouts of her fellow pilots echoed in her ears. In her dream, she was still in control, still making split-second decisions that could save lives or doom them. Then a sudden flash of lightning jolted her awake, her hand instinctively tightening around the armrest. The real world came rushing back. The soft hum of the cabin, the distant chatter of passengers, the dim lighting of early morning. Leaned back, trying to shake off the remnants of her nightmare. She rubbed her temples and glanced around. The flight attendants moved efficiently, checking seat belts, collecting trash, preparing for the first meal service. The elderly man in 8B murmured to his companion about the weather, nodding the dark clouds gathering beyond the plane's window. His gaze drifted to the same clouds, feeling an inexplicable unease, a tension she couldn't quite explain. She shook her head. She was imagining things. After years in the military, she had learned to anticipate danger, but she had also learned to recognize when fear was simply her mind playing tricks. Flying commercially was supposed to be different, safe, routine, ordinary. And yet, a small part of her mind remained alert, scanning the horizon in ways most passengers couldn't comprehend. Thoughts drifted again to Emma. Her daughter had begged her to stay for breakfast that morning, had promised she would be home in time to read a story before school, but duty had intervened, as it always did. The pull between the ordinary life she wanted and the extraordinary past she carried was constant, a tug-of-war she had long since accepted as normal. For now, she allowed herself to drift, the soft vibration of the plane and the gentle rocking of the wings lulling her into a fragile peace. Suddenly, a faint announcement cut through the cabin, barely audible over the engine hum. "Ladies, we are currently experiencing slight turbulence as we ascend." Ears perked up automatically, a trained reflex. She opened her eyes fully, scanning the cabin with a practiced glance. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, no immediate danger. She exhaled slowly, dismissing the warning as standard procedure. Yet as her gaze wandered back to the window, she noticed something subtle, a flicker of movement far off in the clouds, almost imperceptible. Her instincts tingled. Years of experience had trained her to notice the smallest anomaly, the tiny sign that could indicate a problem. She shook her head again, forcing herself not to overthink. Perhaps it was just her imagination, fueled by dreams and fatigue. Leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes, willing herself to rest, unaware that this nap would soon be shattered. A calm flight, a simple journey, was about to turn into something extraordinary. The hum of engines, the quiet murmurs of passengers, the gentle rocking of the aircraft, all would soon be replaced by urgency, fear, and the necessity of skill she had long left behind. And then, in the midst of that fragile peace, the voice came over the intercom, clear, urgent, and impossible to ignore. "If there are any passengers on board with flight or military experience, please make yourself known to the crew immediately." His eyes snapped open. The nap was over. The ordinary flight she had hoped for had ended in an instant. The adrenaline she had long left behind surged through her veins. Her body stiffened, her mind racing. The world she had temporarily escaped, the world of danger, decision, and life-or-death responsibility, was calling her back. Somewhere in the cabin, passengers whispered, confusion spreading like wildfire. Crew members scanned faces, unsure who might respond. His heart pounded. This was the moment she had trained for, feared, and longed to forget. And yet, deep inside, a single thought crystallized. She could not ignore the call. The nap in 8A was over. The ordinary world was gone, and combat pilot turned civilian was about to be thrust into the extraordinary once again. Heart pounded as the captain's voice echoed again over the intercom, firmer this time, slicing through the quiet hum of the plane like a blade. "Any passengers with flight or military experience, please report immediately to the cabin crew." The words were simple, but the weight behind them sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through her body. Instantly, the quiet routine of a domestic flight shattered. Passengers glanced around nervously. Some muttered to each other, unsure whether it was a joke or a genuine emergency. Flight attendants moved swiftly, scanning faces with a practiced urgency. A woman in the aisle whispered to her husband, "What's going on? Is it a drill?" The murmurs spread, a wave of confusion rippling through the cabin. His eyes darted toward the flight attendant passing by. She wore a crisp uniform and carried a clipboard, her expression a mixture of professionalism and controlled panic. The attendant's gaze caught on the Air Force pin clipped to his jacket, a subtle insignia of past service. She paused, then leaned down, her voice low but firm. "Ma'am, were you a pilot?" The question hung in the air, felt a flicker of hesitation, a familiar inner conflict surfacing. She had left the Air Force years ago, trying to bury the memories of combat, the guilt of lost comrades, the endless tension of life-and-death decisions. Here, in the controlled environment of civilian air travel, she had thought she could leave it all behind. And yet duty was calling again, undeniable and urgent. His mind raced. She weighed the consequences, considered the fear that had kept her from flying for civilians, and the instinct drilled into her from years of service whispered louder than caution. This is what you were trained for. Step up. Finally, she nodded. Yes, she said quietly, almost to herself. Her voice carried a steady calm, but inside, a storm of adrenaline and memories churned. The flight attendant gave a quick, almost imperceptible nod and gestured for her to follow. The aisles were chaotic now. Passengers were whispering frantically, some leaning over their seats to glimpse the scene unfolding. A small child clutched their mother's arm, eyes wide with fear, felt a pang of empathy. They had no idea what was happening, but their lives were suddenly tethered to the decision she was about to make. She swallowed hard, letting the instinctive focus she had relied on for years take over. The crew led her to the cockpit door. His pulse quickened. The door was slightly ajar, revealing the first signs of crisis. The captain was slumped against the seat, his face pale, hands trembling as he tried to grasp the controls. The first officer, younger and clearly inexperienced in high-stress situations, struggled to maintain the plane's level in the turbulence. Sweat streaked his face, and his eyes darted between instruments, the storm outside and the captain's failing movements. His military training kicked in. She assessed the situation instantly. The captain appeared incapacitated, the first officer lacked confidence. The plane was in turbulence, and they were high above the Rocky Mountains with limited margin for error. Time slowed in the cockpit. Every sound, the whine of engines, the rattle of lightning, the creak of metal under pressure, was in her ears. "Step back," she commanded quietly but firmly, moving past the first officer to take a position at the co-pilot seat. Her hands hovered over the controls, feeling the familiar textures and layouts she had memorized for years. Instantly, muscle memory surged. Every button, switch, lever, and gauge spoke to her like an old friend. The storm outside mirrored the tension inside her mind, the turbulence reflecting her racing thoughts. Her eyes flicked to the altimeter, the airspeed indicator, and the artificial horizon. The plane was level for now, but the storm was gaining strength. Lightning flashed, illuminating the faces of passengers pressed against windows far below, some unaware of the precise danger overhead. Felt a deep, almost physical connection to the lives suspended in her hands. She remembered Afghanistan. She remembered the night she had lost her wingman to enemy fire, the smoke filling the cockpit, the deafening roar of engines, and the chilling silence that followed. Guilt had haunted her for years, a shadow she could never fully shake. Now, at 30,000 feet, she faced a new test, one that demanded both technical skill and courage. His hands gripped the yoke. "Captain, can you hear me?" she asked. The man blinked weakly, attempting to respond but faltering. He stammered. The words were barely audible over the thunder outside. She nodded, confirming what she already knew. She was now in full control. Turning to the first officer, she spoke with calm authority, masking the adrenaline thrumming through her veins. "I've got it. Follow my instructions. Keep the radio open and monitor systems. We can do this." The young officer nodded, visibly relieved to have someone experienced at the helm. Focused entirely on the instruments. Outside, the plane was buffeted by the storm, lightning splitting the sky in jagged veins of white and gold. Turbulence shook the fuselage violently. Each decision had to be precise. Each adjustment mattered. She recalled every emergency procedure drilled into her during combat flights, during simulator training, during nights when mistakes had meant death. Those lessons now applied in a different arena. Civilian lives, innocent and untrained passengers, suspended in the balance of skill and luck. The flight attendants returned to the cockpit door, whispering updates about passenger conditions. Some were panicking, others attempting to comfort frightened children. Absorb the information, integrating it with her plan. Stabilize the aircraft first, communicate clearly, and prepare for a controlled descent. She visualized the steps in her mind, each sequence rehearsed hundreds of times in simulators and combat missions. Yet beneath the technical focus, her emotions churned. Fear, responsibility, and adrenaline mixed into a potent cocktail. She reminded herself that panic was a liability, control was survival. Her eyes flicked to the storm outside, lightning illuminating the cabin and passengers' faces, some frozen in fear, some praying silently. She drew strength from the memory of her wingman, her mentors, and the countless missions that had taught her to remain calm when chaos reigned. The intercom crackled. "Any updates on your status, flight crew?" Air traffic control's voice came crisp and urgent. Responded immediately, her tone calm but firm. "We have an emergency. Captain is incapacitated. I am assuming control of the aircraft. We need guidance for emergency landing. Aircraft is currently stable, but weather is severe." As she spoke, the storm outside intensified. Lightning struck closer, and turbulence battered the fuselage like invisible fists. Hands never wavered. Muscle memory, focus, and sheer willpower guided her movements. Each adjustment to the yoke, each throttle correction, each communication with the first officer and ground control was deliberate, calculated, and life-saving. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that had accompanied her during missions abroad. It was the same rush, yet different. Here, the stakes were civilians, strangers, children, families. She allowed herself a single thought: she would not fail. She could not fail. Passengers murmured and glanced toward the cockpit, sensing the tension. Felt a strange kinship with them, a shared vulnerability that heightened her sense of responsibility. Every decision, every movement could alter the course of their lives. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the cockpit, the clouds, the distant mountains. Gaze hardened, focus sharpening. She had trained for this. She had survived worse. And now in Seat 8A it was her turn to take command, not as a student, not as a civilian, but as the pilot she had always been. The storm outside howled, but her mind was clear. The call for experienced pilots had brought her out of a nap and thrust her into the eye of a storm. Her past and present converged in that moment, blending fear with courage, hesitation with action, doubt with unwavering resolve. And as the first officer glanced at her with trust-filled eyes, she realized the ordinary flight was over. The extraordinary had begun. Hands gripped the yoke as the storm outside intensified. The plane rocked violently, thunder rattling the fuselage, lightning illuminating the cockpit in brief, blinding flashes. Her eyes darted between instruments and the dark horizon beyond the windshield. Every dial, gauge, and indicator told a story, and read them all with practiced precision. She could sense the subtle shifts in altitude, the fluctuations in air pressure, the twitch of the wings under the assault of the storm. The captain slumped further against his seat, face pale and expression strained, barely conscious. Heart tightened as she realized the gravity of the situation. The man who had commanded this aircraft for years was suddenly incapacitated, and she now held the lives of everyone on board in her hands. The first officer beside her, a young man in his mid-20s, swallowed hard, eyes wide with fear. He had experience in commercial flight, but nothing on this scale, especially not in a storm like this. His voice, calm and commanding, cut through the tension. "Listen to me. We have turbulence and low visibility. I am assuming control. I need you to monitor instruments and call out any anomalies. Can you do that?" The young officer nodded, trembling. Yes, ma'am, I can do that." His mind raced. The flight was far from ordinary, and the storm was just the first obstacle. She took a deep breath, grounding herself. Memories of combat missions returned, not the fear, not the chaos, but the focus. In Afghanistan, she had faced flak bursts, missile attacks, and engine failures midair. She had learned that clarity in the cockpit could save lives. She let those lessons guide her now. Adjusting the yoke, she leveled the plane as best she could. The artificial horizon wavered and the wings dipped under the force of violent gusts, countered with precise movements, subtle yet effective. Sweat stung her eyes, but she ignored it, blinking rapidly to maintain focus. Outside, the storm was relentless. Rain pelted the windshield in sheets, and lightning split the sky with deafening roars. Every passenger below was unaware of the near catastrophe above their heads. Altitude dropping too quickly, the first officer called, voice shaking. Adjusted the throttle, nudging the nose up slightly, stabilizing the descent. She felt the familiar thrill of control and danger that had once defined her life. But this was different. No squadron to rely on, no backup missions, just civilians, strangers, and herself. Each second mattered. A wrong move could be catastrophic. The plane shuddered violently and instinctively leaned into the controls. She remembered the drills, the emergency maneuvers, the countless simulator hours that had prepared her for this exact type of scenario. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved with precision, her mind calculating vectors, speed, and wind resistance. Each adjustment brought stability, even if fleeting. She glanced at the captain. He was barely conscious, lips moving weakly. We need," he whispered, and she understood without words. His trust was implicit, unspoken, and it bolstered her resolve. Had been through worse, but this felt different. The stakes were higher because the lives involved were innocent, untrained, and utterly dependent on her skill. Suddenly, the plane shuddered violently as a bolt of lightning struck nearby. The fuselage rattled, alarms chimed, and a flash of fear shot through the cockpit. Stomach knotted, but she didn't falter. She stabilized the aircraft, countering the tilt and keeping the nose level. She spoke calmly over the intercom, addressing passengers in a measured tone. "Ladies and we are experiencing turbulence. Please remain calm and keep your fastened. We are handling the situation." Her words were deliberate, intended to reassure, but she could hear the tension in the cabin, the stifled murmurs, the whispered prayers, the fear that rippled through the passengers, drew strength from their reliance on her. Failure was not an option. The storm outside continued its relentless assault. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder shook the fuselage, and the plane groaned under the pressure of turbulent winds. His mind flashed back to her time in combat zones, dodging missiles, navigating through gunfire, executing emergency landings on barely stable terrain. The memories weren't just recollections. They were training, an arsenal of experience that she now wielded to protect lives. Her hands danced across the controls, adjusting flaps, throttles, and rudders with precise timing. Every second was a test of skill and nerve. She monitored airspeed, altitude, and fuel, calculating the fastest and safest route to an emergency landing. The first officer called out readings as she instructed, each voice crackling through the tense air. Then another problem arose. The storm had caused a minor electrical fluctuation, triggering alarms and blinking warnings on the dashboard. His pulse quickened. She assessed the instruments, identifying the issue, a temporary short in one system, and made quick adjustments. The plane shuddered, but it was stable. Control had been regained, but the storm was far from over. His mind raced, considering every scenario. The nearest major airport was over an hour away. With the storm intensifying, visibility was near zero. Emergency procedures required careful planning and precise execution. She calculated speed, fuel consumption, and approach angles, mentally rehearsing each maneuver before making it. Every decision was deliberate, measured, and critical. She glanced at the first officer again. "Keep monitoring systems. Call out any irregularities immediately. Trust me, we will land this plane safely." The young officer nodded, swallowing hard. His calm authority reassured him, even as the storm continued to batter the aircraft. She had learned long ago that a leader's composure could instill confidence, even in moments of absolute chaos. Lightning struck nearby again, illuminating the cockpit and briefly revealing the terrified faces of passengers peering through windows. Stomach tightened. These were lives she had never known, yet their safety now depended entirely on her skill and judgment. She drew a deep, steadying breath, channeling the same focus that had saved her squadron in combat. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the cockpit was a crucible of tension, skill, and nerve. Adjusted controls, countering turbulence and stabilizing the plane. She monitored every instrument, every gauge, every subtle shift in altitude. Her hands moved with precision, guided by experience and instinct. Every decision mattered, every movement had consequences. Time seemed to stretch, each second a lifetime. His mind was fully present, fully aware, fully alive. The plane was more than metal and machinery. It was responsibility incarnate, a vessel of human lives, fragile yet formidable under her guidance. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, steadied the aircraft. The storm had not passed, but the immediate turbulence had lessened. Passengers, still unaware of the full severity of the crisis, murmured anxiously. Hands hovered over the controls, ready for the next challenge. She allowed herself a moment to reflect. The ordinary flight she had begun with a nap in seat 8A had transformed into a crucible of courage, skill, and instinct. The call for experienced pilots had pulled her from civilian life and thrust her back into a role she had thought she had left behind. Knew the real challenge was still ahead. The storm was far from over and the plane still needed to land safely. But for now, she had regained control. She had asserted authority in the cockpit, stabilized the aircraft, and reminded herself, and everyone aboard, that experience, focus, and courage could triumph over chaos. And in that moment, high above the Rocky Mountains, embraced the truth she had long avoided. She was still a pilot. She was still a fighter. And she would not let fear define her, not today, not ever. The cockpit settled into a tense rhythm. The storm raged on outside, but inside, calm, practiced hands guided the aircraft with unyielding resolve. The flight was far from over, but she had reclaimed control. And now, the true test of skill, courage, and nerve awaited, the descent and landing that would decide the fate of every life on board. The first signs of trouble had appeared like distant whispers, almost unnoticeable at first. Seated in 8A, had been leaning back in her chair for a brief rest, eyes closed, unaware of the brewing chaos above the clouds. She had intended only a short nap, a fleeting moment to gather strength before resuming her ordinary day. But a sudden lurch of the plane jolted her upright. The familiar hum of the engines was no longer a comforting backdrop. Instead, it had become an erratic, vibrating warning, resonating through the cabin like an unspoken alarm. Passengers around her stirred nervously. The mother in 14C clutched her child, whispering reassurances she did not entirely believe. The elderly man in 8B leaned forward, gripping the armrest with both hands, knuckles white. Instincts, honed from years of high-pressure flights, flared instantly. She pushed the nap aside and scanned the cabin. Crew members moved swiftly down the aisles, their composed faces betraying the tension in their eyes. Something was wrong. The plane shook violently as turbulence began to grow, tossing unprepared passengers like rag dolls. Drinks spilled, a tray clattered to the floor, and the overhead compartments rattled ominously. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and we are encountering unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with fastened. Crew, brace for adjustments." His mind snapped into focus. She recognized the tone, the cadence, the subtle shift in urgency. This was no ordinary turbulence. Something deeper, more dangerous, was brewing in the sky above. She rose from her seat, moving toward the cockpit with a deliberate, purposeful stride. Every step resonated with years of training, every thought focused on preparation and control. Entering the cockpit, she saw the first officer already monitoring erratic instrument readings. The captain's hands were tight on the yoke, eyes narrowed, jaw set in tense concentration. He said, voice clipped but measured, "We need you. We have turbulence, electrical anomalies, and possibly wind shear. I need your experience." Nodded, her senses sharpening. She slid into the co-pilot seat and grasped the controls, immediately feeling the subtle vibrations and shifts of the aircraft. Lightning flickered outside, illuminating the storm clouds in sudden, violent flashes. The instruments blinked in warning, showing fluctuations in speed, altitude, and heading. This was more than a storm. It was a test of every decision, every instinct she had cultivated in her years of piloting. The first officer pointed to the altimeter and airspeed indicator. "Altitude's dropping unexpectedly, Captain. Wind shear detected. Speed is fluctuating. Crew reports some cabin disorientation. Hands moved over the yoke with instinctive precision. She adjusted pitch, throttles, and rudder, countering gusts with microcorrections, balancing physics and instinct in a delicate, almost invisible dance. She spoke calmly, issuing directions with clarity. Flaps 20, throttle 15%, brace for sudden shifts. Cabin crew, secure all passengers immediately. Focus on maintaining stability. The turbulence intensified, the plane rocking violently as though caught in invisible hands. Mind raced, calculating trajectories, angles, and descent rates. She could almost feel the storm as a physical entity, pushing, twisting, threatening to tear the aircraft from the sky. And yet, amid the chaos, she remained a center of precision, a steady hand guiding hundreds of lives through the wrath of nature. Memories surfaced briefly. A helicopter ride over Afghan mountains, sudden missile alerts, engine failures, night missions in near-zero visibility. Every lesson she had ever learned, every drill she had practiced countless times, converged into a single focus: survival. This was no longer an ordinary flight. This was a crucible, and she had been called to lead. Lightning struck near the plane, a brilliant flare that illuminated the terrified faces pressed to windows. Passengers gasped, some whispering prayers, others gripping each other tightly. His voice over the intercom cut through the fear. "Remain seated. Fasten your crew is attending to your safety. We are managing the situation. Trust the process. Stay calm." The captain's voice joined her, calmer now, directed and focused. "Prepare for a possible descent. Wind shear may force emergency landing protocols. Runway vectors may need adjustment. Ground control is on standby." Absorb the information, mentally mapping the descent, calculating angles, fuel reserves, wind speed, and runway alignment. Every second was critical. The turbulence continued to batter the aircraft, shaking loose minor items and rattling nerves, yet its presence brought an anchor of calm in the eye of the storm. "First officer, assist with altimeter monitoring and instrument checks. Adjust rudder to counter crosswind at 30 degrees. Maintain current speed. Fluctuations will occur, but anticipate compensation," instructed, her words precise, authoritative, and steady. The first officer nodded, voice tight but cooperative. "Yes, ma'am, adjusting now. Cabin crew report secured passengers." The storm intensified further. Rain pelted the windshield like bullets, lightning flashed violently, and the fuselage quivered with each gust. His mind remained unshakable, processing every vibration, every reading, every environmental variable. She spoke softly to herself, a mantra of focus: assess, adjust, survive. She allowed herself a brief mental review of landing procedures, emergency descent protocols, and storm handling techniques. Muscle memory kicked in, guiding her hands over the controls with practiced precision. Each adjustment, though subtle, countered potential disaster. Every correction meant survival. A jolt sent the aircraft tilting, throwing passengers slightly forward. A scream echoed down the cabin, immediately corrected the roll, stabilizing the plane. "We're maintaining control," she reassured over the intercom. "Brace for turbulence, trust the crew, remain calm." The captain exhaled, tension visible in his face. "I can't thank you enough. Your presence here, it's the difference between order and chaos." Shook her head, focusing on the task. "Focus on instructions, Captain. We get through this together." Minutes stretched like hours as the storm raged. Focus never wavered, eyes scanning instruments, hands responding to every subtle shift in wind and velocity. She coordinated with ground control, confirming runway vectors, alerting emergency crews, and ensuring that preparations were in place for any eventuality. Outside, lightning split the clouds, revealing jagged mountain peaks below. The plane swayed, a fragile dance between gravity and survival. Passengers whispered prayers, clutching loved ones, and somehow, through the fear and the chaos, maintained control. Each movement, each instruction, each decision was deliberate, precise, and life-saving. The first signs of stabilization appeared slowly. Adjustments to throttle and rudder countered wind shifts. Flaps were calibrated perfectly. Instruments settled. Exhaled silently, feeling a subtle shift. The plane was still fighting the storm, but it was no longer at the mercy of it. The first officer glanced at her with admiration. "Stabilized, ma'am. We're holding at 25,000 feet, minimal turbulence." Nodded, a brief flicker of relief passing through her. But she knew this was only the beginning. The storm wasn't over. The descent, approach, and landing remained the next critical phases. Yet in this moment she allowed herself a fleeting acknowledgement. She had guided the aircraft through the initial chaos, asserting calm and control when panic could have taken hold. Lightning flashed again, a reminder of the storm's fury, but's mind was steady. Her eyes, once heavy with sleep in Seat 8A, now scanned the instruments with unwavering precision. The plane, the passengers, the crew, they were her responsibility, and she would see them through. The storm had not yet released its grip, but had claimed the first victory: control amidst chaos, calm amidst fear, and a fragile foothold against the raging turbulence. The descent to safety, the landing that would define this flight, was still ahead, but she was ready. And for the first time that day, she felt fully awake, fully present, and fully alive. Hands moved over the yoke with precision, but her mind began to drift into the shadows of the past. The storm outside was violent, shaking the fuselage, but the turbulence mirrored something deeper, a storm within herself. Memories of Afghanistan resurfaced unbidden, vivid, and raw. She recalled the endless nights of combat flights over rugged mountains. The taste of dust and fear mingled in her mouth. The roar of engines as tracer fire streaked past her cockpit. One mission came into sharp focus: the night she had lost her wingman. They had been tasked with a reconnaissance flight, dodging enemy fire, when an explosion lit the sky like a violent sunset. Had seen her wingman's plane spiraling down, helpless, a plume of smoke marking his final descent. She had screamed into the radio, calling for support, but the response never came. That night, a part of her had died along with him. Guilt had followed her home, a shadow she carried into every subsequent flight, every civilian mission, every attempt at a normal life. Now, sitting in a commercial plane hurtling through a storm, the memories were a strange paradox, painful yet strangely sharpening. They reminded her of who she was, what she could endure, and the responsibility that came with being a pilot. The passengers below didn't know it, but their lives depended on her ability to harness that fear, to turn it into focus and action. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the cockpit and the dark, churning clouds outside. Eyes flicked to the instruments, her hands adjusting flaps, throttles, and rudder with the instinctive precision that only years of experience could produce. Every shift, every subtle movement was calculated. She drew on muscle memory, on lessons learned under fire, on every drill and emergency landing she had ever practiced. The storm outside became a mirror for the one inside, both demanding mastery and composure. She remembered the camaraderie of her squadron, the quiet nods before missions, the unspoken trust among pilots who had seen death together. That trust had been everything, guiding decisions in the most chaotic and dangerous skis imaginable. Now she felt a similar weight in the cockpit, though this time the lives at stake were civilians, strangers, families, children. The responsibility pressed down on her chest, but it also ignited a singular focus. A sudden jolt of turbulence snapped her back into the present. Hands steadied the yoke, her gaze scanning the artificial horizon. The first officer called out, voice tight with fear. Altitude dropping rapidly, turbulence severe, acknowledged with a curt nod. She made precise adjustments, countering the pitch, nudging the throttle, and carefully managing the plane's descent. Her breathing was steady, controlled, each inhale and exhale a deliberate anchor against panic. Despite the external chaos, her mind wandered further into memory. She recalled a night when a sudden sandstorm had thrown her plane off course over enemy territory. Visibility had been near zero, and every decision had been life or death. She had survived that night not because of luck, but because of focus, training, and an unwavering commitment to keeping her team alive. That same resolve now guided her movements as she stabilized the commercial aircraft, aligning it as best she could with an emergency landing trajectory. Thunder shook the fuselage and passengers cried out in surprise, gripping armrests, praying silently. Voice came over the intercom, steady and calm despite her internal adrenaline surge. "Please remain seated with your fastened. We are experiencing severe turbulence, but we are managing the situation. Remain calm. Help is on the way." She allowed herself a brief glance at the passengers, wide eyes, pale faces, trembling hands. She drew strength from their trust. The storm outside seemed to mirror her emotions, violent, unpredictable, and relentless. His memory shifted again, this time to a training exercise during her Air Force days. A simulated engine failure over mountainous terrain, complete with fake alarms and a controlled descent under pressure, had taught her the value of planning and split-second decision-making. Now, she was applying those lessons in a real scenario, with real lives in the balance. Her mind returned to her daughter, Emma. She had promised to be home that morning, a promise broken by the unpredictable demands of her life as a pilot. The thought sharpened her resolve. Every maneuver she executed, every adjustment to the plane, was not just a professional duty, it was a moral imperative. She could not fail. Lightning struck close to the plane, a blinding flash that threw shadows across the cabin and cockpit. Hands tightened on the yoke, her knuckles white. Sweat stung her eyes, but she ignored it, blinking rapidly to maintain focus. She whispered under her breath, a mantra of concentration: breathe, focus, control, save them. The first officer, visibly shaken, glanced at her for reassurance, offered a calm nod, masking the storm of emotion inside her. "We are managing. Watch your instruments, stay with me," she instructed. He swallowed hard and nodded again, voice barely audible. "Yes, ma'am." Suddenly, a new complication arose. A minor electrical alarm blinked on the dashboard, warning of a temporary system fault caused by the storm. Assessed the instruments quickly, confirming it was a minor fluctuation, then made precise adjustments to stabilize the plane. The wings shuddered, the engines groaned, but the aircraft held. She allowed herself a small, fleeting relief, knowing the real challenge, the descent and landing, was yet to come. His mind alternated between past and present. She remembered the quiet nights in the desert, staring at the stars after missions, grappling with the lives she could not save. She remembered the laughter of her squadron, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose. Now flying a commercial aircraft over the Rocky Mountains in a violent storm, she felt that same sense of duty, amplified and focused. Every decision she made had weight, every action mattered. The passengers murmured and whispered, sensing the tension but unaware of its full magnitude. Drew strength from that trust. Failure was not an option. Skill, experience, and calm would carry them through. She adjusted the plane once more, aligning it with what she hoped would be a manageable path toward an emergency landing. Outside, lightning continued to strike the sky, illuminating clouds churned like molten silver. Rain hammered the fuselage, and the plane groaned under the constant assault. Hands were steady, her eyes sharp, her mind alive with calculation and memory. She visualized each maneuver, rehearsed each adjustment, and let her instincts, honed over years of combat and training, guide her actions. Time seemed to stretch, each second a fragile balance of fear, skill, and hope. Felt the weight of responsibility press down like a physical force, but she refused to succumb. She was trained for moments like this. She had survived worse. And now, 30,000 feet above the ground, she had no choice but to confront the storm, both outside and within. A final jolt of turbulence shook the plane, and hands moved instinctively. The first officer called out, "We're stabilizing, but visibility is almost zero," nodded, acknowledging the new challenge. She took a deep breath, letting years of training, experience, and memory converge into one single focused purpose: keep the plane steady, keep everyone alive. And in that moment, as lightning cracked the sky and thunder shook the fuselage, realized the truth she had long avoided. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. She had survived combat, loss, and doubt. Now she would survive this storm, and she would lead everyone on board safely home. The storm raged, the plane quivered, but within the cockpit, hands, mind, and heart were resolute. She was ready for the descent. She was ready for the landing. She was ready to fight for every life on board. Hands remained steady on the yoke, but her mind began shifting outward, calculating angles, speed, and the resources on the ground that could help her. The storm raged violently, a torrent of rain and wind lashing the plane as it sliced through the clouds. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the aircraft in stark, harsh light. The hum of the engines seemed small compared to the roar of the storm, yet felt a singular focus in the chaos. Every decision now had to be precise. From the cockpit made contact with air traffic control, her voice calm yet urgent. "Denver Tower, this is Flight 438. Captain is incapacitated. I am assuming control. Request immediate guidance for emergency landing." The young first officer beside her monitored instruments nervously, occasionally calling out readings, but experience and authority guided every movement. Below them, ground crews mobilized with precision. Emergency personnel were briefed on the plane's trajectory, emergency services on standby for any eventuality. Lights on the runway blinked through the storm, a beacon guiding them through the darkness. Mentally mapped the path to the airport, accounting for turbulence, limited visibility, and fuel levels. Every second was critical. The storm had reduced margin for error, and the clock was ticking. On the ground, a young air traffic controller coordinated efforts with seasoned veterans. His hands trembled over the console as alarms and radar blips demanded attention. His voice over the radio cut through the tension, firm and authoritative. "Maintain course monitoring and emergency protocols. I need clear vectors for approach. Keep passengers informed. Repeat, passengers informed." His panic began to ease, replaced by confidence fueled by his calm leadership. Back in the cockpit, assessed fuel reserves and storm patterns. The plane was heavy, engines straining against turbulent winds. Rain battered the windshield, distorting the runway lights below. She spoke over the intercom, her voice controlled and measured. "Ladies, and we are preparing for an emergency landing. Remain seated and keep your fastened. Crew members will guide you." Passengers murmured anxiously. Some held children tightly, others whispered prayers, gripping armrests. Fear radiated through the cabin, palpable yet contained by steady words. She drew on every lesson learned from military flights, commercial simulations, and past crises, channeling the chaos into focus. Each movement of the yoke was deliberate, every communication precise. Lightning struck near the plane, illuminating terrified faces pressed against the windows. His mind remained razor-sharp, calculating wind drift, descent rate, and angle of approach. The first officer called out, "Stabilizing at 2,000 feet, ma'am, but visibility is down to near zero." Nodded, adjusting flaps and throttle with careful precision. The runway lights appeared as faint streaks in the storm's fury, guiding her through the darkness. Meanwhile, ground crews worked frantically. Fire trucks, ambulances, and medical teams themselves, lights flashing through sheets of rain. Airport personnel cleared runways and taxiways, coordinating emergency lanes. The tension in the control tower was palpable. Every decision made would determine whether this landing ended in safety or disaster. His mind flashed to the passengers, to their lives, families, and dreams. She thought of the little girl clutching her mother's hand 2 rows back, and of elderly passengers whose faces were pale with fear. Each life strengthened her resolve. Panic had no place in this cockpit. Focus and experience were their only protection. She adjusted the plane again, compensating for wind shear and turbulence. The first officer called out minor system alerts and responded with swift, deliberate action. Every motion, every calculation was a dance with physics, engineering, and human lives. Sweat stung her eyes, and her fingers ached from gripping the controls, but she ignored it. There was no room for hesitation. The storm intensified as they approached the airport. Rain pounded the windshield, visibility was near zero, and lightning flashed in rapid succession. Reminded herself to breathe, to slow her mind, to rely on muscle memory honed over years of high-pressure flights. She visualized the landing, mentally rehearsing each step. Throttle adjustments, flaps, alignment, descent rate, everything had to be executed flawlessly. Ground guidance were approaching final descent. "What's the wind situation?" asked. "Wind is gusting up to 45 knots, visibility at a quarter mile, runway cleared and ready." Voice came through, steadier now, bolstered by confidence. "Emergency teams are in place. You have full clearance." Nodded silently. It wasn't enough to hear it, she had to trust it, to act on it with absolute focus. She adjusted the nose slightly, countering gusts, lining the plane with the runway as best she could. Thunder shook the plane violently, and passengers screamed, clutching seats and crying. Ignored the panic around her, centering herself on the instruments, the controls, the subtle shifts of the aircraft in the storm. The first officer called out, voice trembling, "Stabilized at 1,000 feet, ma'am. Engines performing normally." Felt a brief surge of relief, but the landing was not yet complete. The storm's fury was relentless. She adjusted descent rate, flaps, and throttles again, making micro-corrections to counter wind and turbulence. She glanced at the passengers, imagining their lives suspended above the storm. Each one depended on her judgment, skill, and calm. She drew strength from the responsibility, from the same sense of duty that had carried her through combat missions. Fear had no place in her cockpit, only precision and courage mattered. Lightning illuminated the runway again, closer now. Eyes narrowed, hands steady. The storm was still raging, but the plane's alignment was nearly perfect. She adjusted throttle and flaps one final time, preparing for touchdown. Muscle memory guided her every action, each movement executed with the calm precision of years of experience under pressure. The plane dipped slightly as gusts battered it, but held firm. The first officer called out readings and responded with small, precise adjustments. The runway was within sight now, glowing faintly through the sheets of rain. Emergency crews waited, ready for any outcome, but trusted herself, her training, and her instincts. A brief lull in the storm allowed her to focus entirely on landing. She adjusted throttle and nose, guiding the plane toward the runway with precision. The first officer's voice, calm now, relayed minor wind shifts, adjusted flaps and pitch, preparing for touchdown. Inside the cabin, passengers clutched each other, some crying, some silently praying. His intercom voice remained calm. "Remain seated, stay calm. We are almost there." She felt a strange mixture of fear, relief, and determination. The storm was still there, but control had been regained. His mind replayed the past, combat, loss, fear, triumph, melding with the present. She was no longer just a civilian or a former pilot. She was the only thing standing between the plane and disaster. Every life, every family, every prayer depended on her next moves. And as the runway lights grew brighter, cutting through the storm, steadied her hands, focused her mind, and prepared for the most critical moment of the flight. The landing that would decide the fate of everyone aboard. Hands gripped the yoke like steel, knuckles white, as the plane descended into the heart of the storm. Rain pelted the windshield with relentless force, each drop a tiny hammer against the glass, each gust of wind threatening to push the plane off course. Lightning cracked the sky with blinding brilliance, followed by thunder that shook the fuselage, rattling the instruments and rattling the nerves of passengers far below. The first officer beside her called out instrument readings, voice trembling slightly. "Altitude at 800 feet, descent rate increasing. Runway lights still visible, ma'am." His mind was razor-sharp. She processed every number, every gauge, every flicker of warning lights. Muscle memory, honed over years of combat missions and high-stakes simulations, guided her hands. She adjusted throttle, pitch, and flaps with precision, each movement deliberate, each adjustment calculated. Panic had no place here, only focus, only control. Outside, the storm was a living, breathing entity. Winds shifted unpredictably, gusts slamming into the fuselage, forcing the plane to tilt sharply. Countered, banking gently, stabilizing the wings, guiding the nose toward the runway. She imagined herself back in Afghanistan, dodging flak and missiles, maneuvering through chaos with her squadron relying on her decisions. The stakes were different now, but the instincts were the same. "Watch the crosswind," the first officer shouted as a sudden gust pushed the plane sideways, adjusted the rudder immediately, correcting the alignment. The runway lights wavered like flickering beacons in the storm, but she kept her focus. Every second was crucial, every correction mattered. Failure was not an option. Thoughts flickered briefly to the passengers. She imagined the family in 14C, a mother holding her young daughter's hand, the elderly man in 8B gripping his armrest, a couple whispering frantic prayers. Each life on board was precious, dependent entirely on her ability to master the storm. The weight of responsibility was immense, but it also steeled her nerves. She was trained for moments like this. She could not and would not fail. Lightning illuminated the cockpit, casting harsh shadows across face and hands. She blinked against the sudden brightness, recalibrating her vision instantly. Instruments blinked warning signals, but she ignored minor distractions, focusing only on the critical data: altitude, airspeed, alignment, and descent rate. The plane shuddered violently as another gust slammed into the fuselage. Fought to maintain control, nudging the yoke, adjusting throttle, stabilizing the nose. The first officer's voice was steady now, a reflection of the calm confidence exuded. Stabilized, runway alignment within 2 degrees. Allowed herself a brief nod of approval. 2 degrees might seem minor, but in a storm like this, it was a small victory. She recalculated descent trajectory, adjusting flaps to slow the plane just enough while maintaining lift. Rain streaked across the windshield in sheets, visibility barely a quarter mile, but she could see the faint runway lights cutting through the darkness. She remembered an emergency landing from her military days, a helicopter forced down in hostile territory during a sandstorm. The same principles applied: anticipate, adjust, stay calm, trust training. She let those memories guide her now, transforming fear into precision. A sudden lightning strike illuminated the horizon. The wind shifted abruptly, pushing the plane off course by several feet. Countered immediately, banking gently, nudging rudder and throttle, stabilizing the aircraft. The storm was unrelenting, a test of skill, nerves, and courage. Every passenger on board was counting on her ability to master it. "Prepare for final approach," she said calmly over the intercom, voice steady and authoritative. "Remain seated, keep fastened, crew will guide you." In the cockpit, adjusted flaps and landing gear, feeling the familiar resistance of each mechanism, every movement precise. Her heart pounded, adrenaline surged, but her hands were steady. She recalled countless emergency procedures drilled into her memory. Descent angles, touchdown techniques, crosswind management. Each calculation mattered, each second counted. The plane dipped suddenly as another gust hit. Countered instinctively, stabilizing the wings, adjusting throttle to maintain altitude. The first officer called out minor warnings, nothing critical but enough to demand vigilance. His mind was a machine of focus, filtering out distractions, prioritizing survival. The runway lights grew brighter, closer now, but the storm had one final test. Gusts buffeted the fuselage, lightning flashed dangerously close, and turbulence threatened to destabilize the approach. Held firm, recalculating descent angles in real time, predicting the storm's behavior, and countering each challenge with swift precision. Passengers clutched each other, whispering prayers, their fear palpable. His voice came over the intercom again, calm and steady. "We are aligned with the runway. Please stay calm. We will land safely." Another gust struck, throwing the plane slightly off balance. Adjusted the yoke, nudged the rudder, corrected throttle, and stabilized. Sweat stung her eyes, muscles ached from the constant strain, but she remained resolute. Each adjustment was deliberate, a dance with physics, the storm, and gravity. She remembered the faces of her squadron from Afghanistan, wingmen she had lost, friends she had saved, lives dependent on her decisions. Those memories fueled her now. This storm, this plane, these civilians, they were her responsibility. She would not fail. The runway lights grew sharper, the ground approaching, guided the plane into final alignment, adjusting descent rate carefully. Gusts threatened to push them off course, but she countered with precision, every adjustment exact. The storm raged around them, but inside the cockpit, his hands and mind were steady. Altitude 100 feet, 50 feet, 30, 20. The first officer called out, voice steady now, matching's calm. Adjusted throttle, lowered the nose slightly, flaps fully deployed. Rain pelted the windshield, lightning flashed nearby, turbulence rocked the plane, but she held control. The runway was moments away. Every life on board depended on her next moves. She whispered under her breath, a mantra of focus and determination. Breathe, focus, control, save them. Touchdown approached, the final, critical moment. Adjusted landing gear one last time, ensuring wheels aligned perfectly with runway lights. Gusts buffeted the fuselage violently, and the plane quivered under the storm's assault. She countered with subtle yoke adjustments, guiding the aircraft down with precision honed from years of combat and emergency training. Finally, the wheels touched the wet tarmac, a thunderous spray of water erupting beneath them. Held the plane steady, countering crosswinds, braking carefully and guiding the aircraft to a smooth, controlled stop. The storm was still raging, but the immediate danger was over. Exhaled, allowing herself the smallest fraction of relief. She had done it. She had turned chaos into control, fear into action, and skill into survival. Passengers erupted in quiet applause, tears of relief streaking faces pale from terror. The crew moved swiftly to secure the cabin, ensuring everyone was safe. Eyes met the first officer's. A nod, silent but full of gratitude, passed between them. They had survived together. Outside, emergency crews rushed toward the plane, prepared for any eventuality. Guided the aircraft to a safe stop, engines humming steadily. The storm was still powerful, but her mastery had ensured that everyone on board would survive. And as she finally leaned back in the cockpit seat, heart still racing, allowed herself a brief reflection. She had faced combat, loss, fear, and chaos. Yet here, over the Rocky Mountains in a commercial aircraft, she had survived again. She had saved lives, not with luck but with skill, focus, and courage. The storm raged, but inside the cockpit, a calm victory had been won. The tires of Flight 438 screeched lightly on the wet tarmac as guided the plane into its final position. The engines idled, the violent shaking of turbulence replaced by a fragile stillness. Rain continued to fall, but the storm's fury had lessened just enough to allow emergency crews to move in. Inside the cabin, passengers were frozen in their seats for a moment, catching their breath, processing the sudden transition from chaos to relative safety. Exhaled slowly, releasing the tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hand still hovered near the yoke, twitching slightly as her mind replayed the violent gusts, lightning strikes, and every critical adjustment she had made during the descent. The first officer beside her, pale but stable, looked over and managed a small smile. We did it," he said quietly. Nodded but didn't speak immediately. She needed a few moments to collect herself. The adrenaline was fatting, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion. For hours or maybe minutes, it was hard to measure time when every second had been life or death. Her mind had been entirely focused on survival. Now, with the plane still, the quiet was deafening. The cabin crew began their organized work. Flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, checking passengers, comforting children, and quietly instructing everyone to remain calm as they prepared to evacuate. Rose slightly from her seat, voice steady as she addressed the cabin. Ladies, and we have safely landed. Please remain seated while the crew prepares for disembarkation. I want to thank all of you for your cooperation during this emergency. You all remained calm, which helped us manage the situation successfully. Murmurs of relief swept through the cabin. Some passengers hugged, others wept softly. A young boy clung to his mother, whispering, "We're okay now, right?" She nodded, tears in her eyes, and smiled through the tension. Watched silently, feeling a deep sense of responsibility and pride. Each of these lives had depended on her, and now they were safe. Outside the cockpit, the airport's emergency response team had assembled. Fire trucks, ambulances, and paramedics waited as standard procedure, but the plane had come to a controlled stop without major incident. Allowed herself a brief moment of reflection, studying the wet runway, the dark clouds above, and the flashing lights of the emergency crews. The storm was still visible in the distance, but it no longer controlled the moment. The captain, now fully conscious, entered the cockpit. His face was pale, but he offered a grateful smile. "I don't have words. You saved everyone, truly." Shook her head. "Captain, this was a team effort. You did what you could until you couldn't. The rest was up to experience, training, and focus. We all survived." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Still, I don't know anyone who could have done this better." The first officer glanced between them. "It was remarkable. You handled every adjustment perfectly. I've never seen anything like it." Allowed herself a faint smile but didn't linger on praise. There were passengers to debrief, safety procedures to follow, and medical checks to ensure no one had been injured during the landing. She rose from the cockpit and followed the crew, her uniform damp from sweat and rain, hair sticking to her forehead. Each step was heavy with exhaustion but purposeful. In the cabin, the passengers were slowly being guided out. The little girl in row clung to her mother, still frightened, but relief softened the tension. An elderly man patted his arm as she passed, whispering, "Thank you, you kept us alive." Nodded silently, a lump forming in her throat. The weight of gratitude was almost as intense as the landing itself. A paramedic approached, checking on her vitals as part of protocol. She offered a reassuring smile. "Everything looks normal, ma'am, but I recommend you hydrate and rest. You've been through an extreme high-stress situation." Nodded, accepting the clipboard with a quiet, tired gratitude. As passengers exited the plane, airport staff and news crews gathered outside. The storm had caused minimal delays now, but the story of the emergency landing was already circulating. Ignored the cameras, letting the attention pass. She didn't seek recognition. What mattered was that the passengers were safe. Later, in a quiet lounge away from the cameras and flashing lights, finally allowed herself to reflect on the flight. The adrenaline surge that had carried her through the descent now gave way to exhaustion, but also a sense of accomplishment. She remembered every gust, every lightning strike, every calculation. She replayed the emergency landing in her mind, step by step, analyzing decisions, noting what had worked, what could have been done differently. Her thoughts turned to the passengers, strangers whose lives had been in her hands. She thought about the mother and daughter, the elderly man, the nervous young couple. Each person was a story, a life saved, and she had been the critical link between chaos and survival. Also reflected on her own journey. She had thought that napping in seat 8A earlier that day would be a quiet, uneventful flight. Instead, she had been thrust into a situation that reminded her of her military days, where every decision could mean life or death. She realized that her skills, honed in combat and high-pressure scenarios, were not just applicable to war zones. They were relevant whenever lives hung in the balance. The captain approached her once again, offering a small, solemn handshake. "You reminded all of us what true professionalism and courage look like." Nodded quietly. "It was my duty, that's all. We do what's necessary when people depend on us." The first officer smiled, his fear replaced by admiration. "I've learned more in these last few minutes than in my entire career. Thank you for leading." Felt a subtle, deep sense of closure. The storm outside had tested her, the passengers had trusted her, and she had not failed. And yet she knew the emotional weight of the experience would linger. High-stakes decisions, life-or-death responsibility. It stayed with a pilot long after the engines were off and the plane was grounded. Sitting in the lounge, sipped water and watched the rain fade. Passengers were escorted to buses or waiting areas, staff coordinated follow-ups, and the airport began returning to normal operations. She felt a quiet pride, a deep sense of purpose reaffirmed. Today she had acted decisively, courageously, and with precision. Today hundreds of lives were safe because she had been ready when the call came. She thought about her daughter Emma and the promise to return home safely. Today that promise had been kept, and for the first time in hours allowed herself to truly rest, knowing that the most critical part of the flight, the landing and survival, was behind her. Even as the storm clouds slowly cleared, understood that heroism was often quiet. It was found in the moments when ordinary people rose to extraordinary challenges, when preparation met opportunity, and when courage overcame fear. Today, she had embodied that truth fully. The airport slowly emptied, but remained seated a moment longer, savoring the quiet. The storm outside was gone, but the lessons, memories, and awareness of responsibility remained. And she knew that no matter what flight came next, no matter what storm she faced, literal or metaphorical, she would face it with the same resolve, focus, and courage that had saved Flight 438. The storm raged on outside, but inside the aircraft, a profound silence had settled. The tires of Flight 438 hissed against the soaked tarmac as the plane came to a complete stop. Emergency crews swarmed around the aircraft, their flashing lights cutting through sheets of rain. Fire trucks, ambulances, and paramedics stood at the ready, but calm control had ensured that no lives were in immediate danger. The tension that had gripped every passenger, every crew member, began to ease, replaced by relief, awe, and gratitude. Sat in the cockpit, still gripping the yoke lightly, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the descent now began to ebb, leaving her exhausted but alert. Beside her, the first officer exhaled, voice shaky but filled with quiet relief. "Ma'am, we did it. Everyone's were okay." Nodded, allowing herself a faint, exhausted smile. "Yes," she said softly, "everyone's okay." Her words were simple, but the weight behind them carried the gravity of what had just occurred. Hundreds of lives had depended on her focus, experience, and courage. The ordinary flight that had begun with her nap in Seat 8A had transformed into a crucible of chaos, heroism, and responsibility. As passengers were guided off the plane by the crew, their expressions varied, some wide-eyed with shock, some teary with relief, and others clapping quietly as they realized the extent of their survival. A little girl ran to her mother, crying in relief. An elderly man patted his arm as he passed, whispering a heartfelt, "Thank you." The weight of their gratitude settled on, a mixture of pride, humility, and exhaustion. The captain, still pale but conscious, leaned on the doorway of the cockpit. His voice was shaky as he addressed her. You saved everyone. I don't know how to," he trailed off, overcome with emotion. Shook her head gently. "Captain, you did what you could. The storm hit fast and the aircraft needed someone with experience at the controls. We worked together. That's what matters," she said calmly, yet the words carried the depth of every sleepless night, every flight, every memory of survival. Outside the cockpit, emergency crews continued their work. Passengers were being escorted to waiting buses, and paramedics checked vital signs, comforted frightened children, and documented the events. His gaze wandered briefly over the wet runway, reflecting on the storm, the aircraft, and the incredible fragility of life. Every flash of lightning had reminded her of how tenuous their survival had been. Every gust of wind had been a test of her nerves, skill, and courage. She finally allowed herself to relax, sitting back in the co-pilot seat. Her mind replayed the flight, the turbulence, the lightning, the precise adjustments she had made, and the calm she had maintained while hundreds of lives depended on her actions. The echoes of fear and responsibility lingered, but now they were tempered by relief and accomplishment. Thoughts drifted to her daughter, Emma. She imagined the little face waiting at home, unaware of the storm, unaware of the chaos above the Rocky Mountains. A pang of longing struck her chest, but it was accompanied by pride. She had lived up to the promise of being a protector, even at great personal risk. The passengers began to emerge from the plane, many looking back with eyes full of admiration. A flight attendant approached, her expression both relieved and awestruck. "Ma'am, you were incredible. The way you handled that, I don't know how to thank you." Offered a tired smile. "Thank the crew and thank the first officer. We all did this together." She leaned back, letting herself exhale fully for the first time since the captain had called for combat pilots. The responsibility, the fear, the storm, it was over. For now. In the terminal, news crews had gathered, alerted to the emergency landing. Phones buzzed with calls from families, friends, and strangers. Passengers recounted the events, some with tears, some with wide-eyed fascination. Stayed quiet, observing the scene, listening to fragments of gratitude, fear, and admiration. It was overwhelming, yet grounding. She realized that heroism often came unannounced, in moments when ordinary decisions became extraordinary. Later, in a quiet corner of the airport, finally allowed herself a moment alone. She stared out the window at the rain-soaked runway, reflecting on the day's events. The storm had been merciless, the odds stacked against her, yet she had prevailed. She had harnessed fear, experience, and instinct to save hundreds of lives. And yet, she felt a strange emptiness, a reminder that while she had acted decisively, the weight of responsibility never truly left a pilot. Her thoughts wandered again to Afghanistan, to the missions that had shaped her, to the friends she had lost, and to the lessons learned under fire. Those experiences had prepared her for this moment, and she realized how much she had grown since those early days. Courage, she understood, was not about fearlessness. It was about action in spite of fear, clarity amidst chaos, and unwavering commitment to the lives depending on you. His phone buzzed. A message from Emma. "Mom, I saw on the news, are you okay?" She smiled softly, typing a reply. "Yes, sweetie, everything is okay. I'll be home soon." She felt a warmth in her chest, a grounding reminder that even in chaos there were anchors, family, and love. As airport personnel began the formal debriefing, gave statements, recounted the sequence of events, and answered questions with the calm professionalism that had carried her through the storm. Every detail mattered, yet her focus remained on the people she had saved, not on herself. She realized that recognition was fleeting, but the lives preserved were eternal. Later, as she walked through the terminal, passengers approached, some still teary, others smiling with relief. Words of thanks and admiration were offered repeatedly, yet felt no pride, only a quiet acknowledgement of responsibility fulfilled. She had acted not for recognition but because it was necessary. It was what she had been trained for, what she had been born to do, what she would do again if called. As the day faded into evening, finally allowed herself to rest. The storm outside had passed, leaving a glistening runway and calm skies. She looked out at the horizon, reflecting on the surreal sequence of events. She had napped in Seat 8A just hours ago, oblivious to the emergency that would call her back into action. The randomness of life, she realized, often intersected with preparedness, and those who acted decisively in those moments were the ones who shaped outcomes. His journey through fear, responsibility, and heroism had reached its conclusion, for now. The passengers had survived, the crew had followed her lead, and the storm had been mastered. She felt a profound sense of closure, yet an awareness that life's challenges never truly ended. They simply awaited the next moment of crisis. Sitting quietly in the terminal, closed her eyes and allowed herself a final thought. Courage was not a solitary act. It was a convergence of preparation, experience, instinct, and the lives entrusted to you. Today, she had lived that truth fully, and though exhaustion weighed heavily, she felt a rare and fleeting peace. Outside, the sun began to break through the clouds, casting golden light on the wet tarmac. A rainbow arched faintly over the runway, a small, quiet reminder that even after the fiercest storms, calm and hope could return. Pilot, protector, and silent hero took a deep breath, ready to return to the world below, forever changed by the events of a single flight, a single call, a single defining day.